B 2.5 variation. So there are two types of variation that you need to know about: continuous and discontinuous variation. Continuous variation has a range of values showing a gradual change in a characteristic across a population. So examples of continuous variation include height and mass. The type of graph you would draw is a histogram. So the bars need to touch. Continuous variation, if you remember, is always something that you can measure. Discontinuous variation has clearly defined into discrete groups. So examples include tongue rolling and hand dominance or blood group, and the type of graph is a bar chart. How does variation arise? So variation in living organisms has both a genetic basis and an environmental basis. So genetic variation exists because of changes to DNA or in their genes or in the chromosomes. A mutation could arise as a random change in the number of chromosomes, such as Down syndrome, or the structure of a gene, such as cystic fibrosis. Variation in genetics also arises due to the independent assortment of the chromosomes during meiosis, and this increases variations because it results in genetically different gametes. And then the random nature of sexual reproduction also gives rise to variation, producing offspring with different phenotypes to each other or to their parents. Environmental variation. This is due to the environment or the surroundings that the individual is brought up in, and this can cause variation. So for example, height can be genetically controlled, but diet can affect height. So it would be a mixture of both. Natural selection is a process where organisms that are better adapted to an environment will survive and reproduce. Natural selection will occur due to, first of all, variation within the phenotypes of a population, that there is a competition for resources such as food, space, or mate. So, for example, you could be thinking within a population of an animal, different heights or different wingspan, that within that you have a range of phenotypes, but then there's competition for a resource. So if you're asked this in a question, if they've told you about an individual, you read what the information they've given and use that to guide you to how you would explain it. So there's competition, like for example, food, space, or mate. This leads to what's known as differential survival. Those with the phenotype that is better adapted, so the characteristic phenotype that is better adapted, are more likely to survive and reproduce, passing on their genes to the next generation. And it's important that you state that they survive and reproduce. And this is known as survival of the fittest. Failure to adapt could result in the extinction of a species over time. So extinction could arise due to climate change, natural disasters, being hunted by humans, hunted by non-native animals that have been introduced by humans, disease, or the loss of a habitat, such as deforestation. So if they can't then adapt to the new environment, then they will not be able to survive or pass on those genes. Example of natural selection that you need to be familiar with is antibiotic resistance, which we looked at in the disease booklet, but I'll just go through it again. So how you would explain it. So there's variation within the bacterial phenotypes. Some are resistant to antibiotics due to a random mutation, and some are not. Treating the bacteria with antibiotics then provides competition. Those that are resistant will survive, and the non-resistant individuals will not survive, and that is your differential survival. The resistant bacteria then are able to reproduce, so the resistant bacteria pass on the resistance gene to the next generation. The number of the resistant bacteria increases, and the number of the non-resistant bacteria will decrease. The link between natural selection and evolution. Darwin used the theory of natural selection to explain the process of evolution. So evolution is a continuing process of natural selection that leads to the gradual change of an organism over time. It may result in the formation of a new species. Fossils provide the evidence for evolution. They show how an organism looked millions of years ago and how it has changed over time. Selective breeding is when humans manipulate plants and animals by selecting desirable characteristics, such as in crop plants or domesticated animals. Humans select the individual plant or animal with a desirable characteristic, such as increased crop yield, disease resistance, longer shelf life. They then breed these to produce offspring. After repeated selection and breeding over many generations, then all the offspring will contain the desirable characteristic. So if we look at some questions, bar chart shows the number of children in the class who were left-handed and the number who were right-handed. Calculate the percentage of children in the class who were left-handed. So reading from the graph, we can see that there were 3 who were left-handed. There are 27 who are right-handed, so altogether there are 30 in the class. So 3 out of 30 multiplied by 100% gives us 10%. Being left-handed or right-handed is an example of discontinuous variation. Draw a circle around another example of discontinuous variation. So height of person can be measured, so it has to be continuous. Length of person's thumb can be measured, so it has to be continuous. But the ability to roll the tongue, you can either do it or you can't, so it's discrete, so it is that one. Antibiotics can help treat bacterial diseases, namely the first antibiotic discovered, so that was penicillin. MRSA is a type of bacteria that has evolved resistance to some antibiotics. Describe how natural selection has led to the evolution of antibiotic resistance in MRSA bacteria. So for this, for 3 marks, the resistant bacteria survives, reproduces and passes on the resistance gene. The list below gives an example of natural selection and selective breeding. So A pug dogs used to be bred to have very flattened faces, but this caused them to have breathing problems. B, snowshoe hares live in North America. They have white coats in winter. In areas where the snow melts earlier in the spring, some snowshoe hares' coat turn brown earlier. C, new varieties of rose plants with strong scents are produced by breeders for flower shows. D, tomato plants have been produced that give the tomatoes a long shelf life. And E, some types of trees found in desert regions have fewer stomata to reduce water loss. Choose 2 letters from the list that describe examples of natural selection. So this is where humans have not been involved. So that would be B and E. The snowshoe hares changing their colour and the trees in the desert. The rest have all had human interaction. The statement below describes the process of natural selection in Staphylococcus bacteria when they come into contact with one type of antibiotic. The statements are not in the correct order. So statement A says Staphylococcus bacteria that are resistant to this type of antibiotic survive and reproduce. B, there is variation in the population of Staphylococcus bacteria. C, the resistant Staphylococcus bacteria in this population pass on their genes to the next generation. D, some bacteria have genes that produce chemicals that make them resistant to the antibiotic. And E, there are an increasing number of antibiotic-resistant bacteria found in this population over time. Write them in the correct order in the empty boxes below to describe the process of natural selection in these bacteria. So B was done first. There is variation in this population. So the next one that we would have would be D. Some have genes that produce chemicals that make them resistant. Then A, they are able to survive and reproduce. Then C, they pass on their genes to the next generation. And then E, there's increasing numbers of the antibiotic-resistant bacteria over time. So you can see 1 mark was given for D being in the correct position, 1 mark for E being in the last position, and then 1 mark for A and C being in the 2nd and 3rd position, in that order. In natural selection, small changes happen in a population over time as individuals adapt to a changing environment. This may result in the formation of a new species. Name the theory that describes this process. That is the theory of evolution. And then what happens if a species fails to adapt to a changing environment? They would become extinct.